All right, I think I'll get started now that it's a little bit past 3 and we see that people are joining us, so they will join us as we start getting going here. Welcome, my name is Meredith Fluke and I'm the director of the Cantor Gallery and the organizer / curator of this exhibition. I'm joined today by Paula Rosenblum, who's the Assistant Director of Operations and Communications at the Cantor. And we've invited Susan Schmidt to join us here today for a virtual gallery talk. So we're excited to experiment with this format. This is an experiment for us. We haven't done something like this before. The way that we expect it to work is that myself, Paula, and Susan are the 3 hosts, and attendees will see us. They'll see the images that we're showing them of the exhibition, and you all can ask questions via the chat function. So if you want to ask a question, you sort of open up that chat function, which you can find if you hover at the bottom of your screen, for those of you who haven't been in endless Zoom meetings for the past couple of weeks. You can write into us via the chat function, and Paula and I will moderate those questions as they come up, and we'll also pause for question sessions as well. I wanted to make sure that I said a special welcome to all the students who are joining us today. We miss you and we wish that we could see you in the gallery and we could be experiencing this show together. We're happy that you're here and that we can connect with you, and we hope to continue connecting with you in whatever way that we can. So, see if I can get this going. Great, so Joys, Sorrows, and Concerns is an exhibition that was in the planning for several years and that opened to the public on March 9th and then closed on March 11th. So we had 2 days with this wonderful show. We were so disappointed to see it closed, and of course we've been looking for ways to represent it virtually. Along with this talk, we'll be hosting an exhibition on the Cantor website, an online exhibition, and this webinar is being recorded, so we will place this webinar up there with other videos and photographs and anything else that we gather from the run of this show. Today we'll be looking at images of the exhibition, and we'll look at other works of art by Susan Schmidt. So, hi Susan, it's my pleasure to introduce Susan. Susan's a member of the visual arts faculty at Holy Cross and has taught here for 33 years. She received her MFA from Pennsylvania State University and is a founding member of the Brick Bottom Artists Building in Somerville, where she has her studio. She also prints at Mixit Studio and is a member of the executive board of the Boston Printmakers and has been connected with the art communities of Boston and Worcester for many decades. This exhibition, Joy, Sorrows, and Concerns, is her first solo show at the Cantor, and it features work that was made throughout her career. So hi, Susan, welcome. Hi. I want to start off with a question for you. In this exhibition, we have together, you and I and everybody who was able to experience it, we saw lots of threads that connected your more than 40 years of work, but also a bit of heterogeneity in look and process. How do you approach the daunting problem of new work? And what tools and ideas do you bring to the studio when you're trying to push your work in an uncertain direction?
It's the problem of how do things come together in the studio. I like to think of the studio as a place for uncertainty. I think about the way William Kentridge talks about the studio in his book, 6 Drawing Lessons. He refers to giving materials or an impulse the benefit of a doubt, and studio work as a kind of irrational game that you set up for yourself for the pure purpose of seeing where it's going to go. But once you set up that game, you have to test it out as rigorously as you can, and you have to try out every different iteration of the work that you make. He talks about making the studio a safe place for stupidity. This print installation in the slide is my most recent work named Joys, Sorrows, Concerns. It came out along last year. I was uncertain most of the year where it would end up. I had for a long time wanted to do a use prints as a components in an installation that would be larger than just printmaking, and this was the opportunity to do this. I wanted to outline some of the different things that came together in making this over the past year. So about a year ago, I was looking at photos online on the internet of like this. There was a flood of images on Google and in the newspaper. This was the time of the family separation policy. So this is a photograph of asylum seekers who were being held in a detention center. And so like everyone, I was looking at these images and they struck me as sort of like a grand history painting for our times. Grand history paintings were paintings with multiple figure groups that were engaged in lots of different activities, like vignettes of activities. And they usually celebrated heroic, historical events. But in this case, it's very different. These are people who are lying down, they're waiting, they lack agency over their lives. And yet you have people who are lying together and embracing and who are taking care of their children and who are going about the business of their lives in the middle of this situation. And so I began to look at pairs of figures or images of children because I have been interested in images of children in my work for a while, and to do very simple ink wash drawings. I mostly looked at the images on my computer and enlarged them, and sometimes used Photoshop to change the levels so I could see them a little bit better. So here's one of the drawings. I drew it on clear film. I had the idea that maybe I could use it as a positive to make a photo etching plate, somewhat like you would use a positive in a contact print in the photo lab. So one of the things that came up to me when I was doing these was whether it was all right to use other people's suffering in my own artwork. Was it a video by William Cantor, a short video called Pain and Suffering, where he talks about his own work exploring the suffering in South Africa due to the apartheid history of South Africa. And he talks about drawing as, yes, you are using other people's suffering, but in a way, by drawing it, you are slowing down, you are paying attention to people, and you are drawing as a compassionate, sort of repetitive activity, but you still are, yes, using other people's experience in your work. So I made a series of these small drawings. So this is the source of that installation. At the same time, I was learning new techniques. I like to think that artists are always working on technique and craft at the same time you're working on idea. And I had been experimenting for a while with photopolymer plate printing. And I started to try to use these images as positives for photo exposures on plates. You could go to the next slide here if you want to.
I can slip to this one. Great.
This one. Sorry.
It's okay.
So I wanted the prints that I was making that were etchings to look just like the drawings. And I spent part of last summer going to the print studio and testing out different exposure times and making test strips from my drawings and seeing if I could get the prints to keep the drawing qualities that I liked so much, which were these watercolor wash effects. And I just hit a dead end. I couldn't get the prints to look like the drawings. They were very crude. So I went to another printmaker who specializes in Toyobo plates, and she taught me to scan the images in and manipulate them in Photoshop and add adjustment layers until the Toyobo plates would read them so that they would look like drawings. And then I had to print them out and use the printed image as a negative positive, so that the plates would eventually end up looking like drawings. So in other words, I had to go through a lot of digital steps in order to achieve what looked like a handmade drawing in the end and what was a drawing in the beginning. So there's a sort of irony here of something that looks very handmade, but it uses a lot of digital processes in
Yeah,
making it.
if I can interrupt you, Susan, I just wanted to say that when you first showed me this piece, that was something that I found so interesting about it, is this sort of need to employ all of these high-tech resources in order to make something look handmade. But that irony where we know that you've made it into a print, right? We can see the plate marks on the piece, and we can see the repetition of these drawings over and over again. It's such an irony that reads, and it sort of, it destabilizes, but at the same time, it's very poignant aspect to this piece that I enjoy.
Mhm. And then, so that was the source and the technique that came together. And another thing I would like to talk about is my influence artists, that I'm always thinking about other artists. And so during the past year, two artists that were on my mind were an Indian artist named Nalini Malani, who had an installation at the ICA. So the upper images here are her installation at the ICA, In Search of Vanished Blood. She is an Indian artist who is a feminist. She is a refugee of the partition of India. She uses her experiences as a woman in India. She explores a lot of different symbols that come from women's lives, but they're also grounded in religious symbols and in Indian mythology. And she does a lot of things, but in this installation, she painted her images onto these plexiglass cylinders. So they were simple paintings. And then the cylinders rotated around and projected her drawings onto the walls of the room. And so these small drawings were made into large projections, and they revolved slowly around the room. And you could go into the room at the ICA and sit down, and the drawings would pass on top of you. So you could literally be an intimate part of her drawing. I loved this installation. I spent time at the ICA, and I drew in my sketchbook there, which I think helped to fix those ideas in my mind. And they came back to me later, the idea of a projected drawing. On the right, we see a big drawing. It's actually 12 feet high by 15 feet wide by Kara Walker. She is an artist that I've always been influenced by. Most of the students know her for her I guess she's more famous for her cutout silhouettes, which depict sort of racial scenes from the antebellum South, where there's a lot of violence and sexual relations acted out between characters. So this is she's very, very versatile, and this is a different body of work that was done around 2017. Now this drawing is at the Harvard Art Museum, and she did these drawings as her response to the white nationalist rally in Charlottesville in 2017. They're wash drawings too, but they're large wash drawings done with a brush, and they're actually cut out and glued down onto the paper. So it's really a drawing collage. And she's an artist that really creates a difficult space for the viewer. She makes her viewers uncomfortable because you're confronted with these images that are, stereotype Black history and are violent. And I just think her work has been really powerful through the years. She's not an activist artist. She doesn't give solutions, but she creates a space that makes us very uncomfortable about race. So these are two of the artists that I was looking at. And then I went back to the studio and I tried to test things out and see what I could do with my prints. And I had a lot of scraps of paper in my prints that were left over from another project that were 9 inches wide. I just held on to them. So I printed on those. And I hung them up on the wall of the print studio, and I noticed that when I hung them up together, they had this repeated effect that the figures would, thank you, the figures would sort of build up a pattern a little bit like wallpaper. Usually when you think about wallpaper, you think about something decorative. So to see these figures in a sort of decorative way when they were originally people that were lying on the floor in a detention center was disturbing. And I thought that was something that I should explore a little bit further. And so I amplified it by increasing the length of the strips and buying more paper until I could fill a wall with these images. And I made a few more plates of figures. And then I had the idea that maybe I could project another kind of drawing over top of them. The figure drawings were done from observation, and it was observation of photographs, but they were drawn, sort of tenderly and trying to get the figure in the right proportion and follow what the figure looked like. Then I wanted to try to get those drawings to work with a more abstract language of drawing, which were symbols. I thought of symbols from the climate movement first, because I think the climate changes are at some of the source of the refugee problems in the world. But in the end, I went through a number of different ideas in my sketchbook, and at the end, I picked symbols that related to the body: a mouth, a megaphone, a labyrinth, a target shaped like a human body, and a drone. Drones are used a lot in surveillance at the border and also to kill. And so I wanted to project these, and my first idea was to do a digital projection. And I was working in January in Millard Art Center with the projectors. I noticed that the digital projection over this large expanse of white paper left a kind of a grid-like pattern of pixels. And I worked a little bit with John Carney to see if we could figure out how to get rid of that. We couldn't. And then I had to try to think of a different solution or a different way to project the drawings. And so I was still thinking about this Nalini Malani installation, but I couldn't imagine doing anything that elaborate. And then John Carney came up with the idea of taking this overhead projector and creating a disc that would rotate slowly on top of the light table using the light and mirror of the overhead projector to project small images onto a large screen. And so he was using a very old school technology. They don't, overhead projectors they used when I was in elementary school. And yet, in order to, so John made this, this projection machine himself, but in order to make it, he had to 3D print many of the parts. There's a series of gears on a motor underneath of that disc. And in order to make the images on the disc, I had to print them out from InDesign onto a piece of film. So in spite of it being very old school, there was a lot of technology that went into figuring it out. And so that is, finally, all of those elements came together into Joys, Sorrows, and Concerns. And I think it took a year for all of those different ideas and technology to come together into this piece.
Great. So there are a couple of questions that are popping up in the sidebar, Susan. One comes from Virginia. Hi, Virginia, who wanted to ask a question about whether you've considered a strategy that enables viewers to respond with other images, that in your desire to evoke empathy is, have you ever thought of a way where viewers could respond or add to the images that you've made? I think I'm understanding the point of that question.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think that gets into sort of socially engaged art, where artists are really interacting with the community and giving the community of people a chance to respond with images. And yeah, that would be something that I really would be interested in the future. It's not something that I have taken on yet at this point, but I think it's I think it would be something that I would definitely be interested in exploring. Yeah.
I see a question also from Christy Rinklin. She says that I'm interested in knowing why making these into prints was essential to this work. Is there a reason why they can't remain as drawing?
Well, I wanted to repeat them a lot. I wasn't sure what I would do with them in the beginning, and I wanted to repeat it. In the end, repeating it in an exact pattern became part of the wallpaper effect. And I did try, just putting all of my drawings up on the wall with push pins and seeing how they worked. And that was interesting too. But this transforming them into prints allowed me to do different kinds of installations with them. And it also made them a little more graphic. They carry from a longer distance.
Great. And I'm going to ask Nancy Burns this question for her, which is, I've noted that many of your prints attempt to retain the expressive qualities of drawing or draftsmanship. Do all or the vast majority of your prints start in the form of preparatory drawings? Or do you
Yes. I almost all of the prints, I either do a drawing first, or you'll see in the earlier work that sometimes I transfer the drawing directly onto a plate. I think printmaking is really an extension of drawing. It originated in drawing, and it amplifies and abstracts drawings. You certainly could argue that you can do now a purely photo-based printmaking that's not tied into drawing, but the way that I'm working with it is very tied into drawing, yeah. And I like that quality of printmaking. So this is early work. So
that's a great transition. Yeah, I was hoping to get you to talk about early stuff, and I just wanted to interject and say that one of the goals that Susan and I had for her exhibition was to show work that ranged from the beginning to the of her work to the present. And so in all of these conversations we had in the studio, we looked at a lot of the early prints and drawings, and we were keen to show some of these early pieces. So I'm glad to have this transition, and I also yes, I'd love to hear more about early work, Susan.
Right, so this is a whole different kind of work really that took me to these big charcoal drawings. It's a different studio process than what I just described in the print installation, a different way of having the work come together. I had gone to graduate school and looked a lot at the work of Edward Hopper. I was interested in him because he is interested in a sense of place. He's a painter who is interested in a sense of place above figure. And he also uses architectural shapes to structure his paintings in a very geometric and sort of concrete way. And the year after graduate school, I moved to Pittsburgh, and I wanted to create a series of prints that would be about the place that I was living. It was my first experience living alone in a city. I lived in the Squirrel Hill neighborhood of Pittsburgh, but I had a studio in an elementary school in the Colfax River Valley. And so these were etchings that I started as drawings. In this case, I sat on the street near where I lived and drew a charcoal drawing. And then later I transferred that drawing as a soft ground drawing through a piece of tracing paper onto a zinc plate. And then I worked on it over a few months and deepened and richened the different textures and tones, and also printmaking kind of abstracts the original drawing a lot. But I was really impressed here in this series by some of the architectural styles in Pittsburgh, these square homes and deep porches and dormer windows built when Pittsburgh was a very wealthy, prosperous city, and the steel mills were wealthy. And so then a few years later, I moved to Boston. And when I moved to Boston, the first thing that I did was to draw facades of buildings again and look at all of these old red brick factory buildings and textile mills that stretched out for such a long way in Worcester and in Boston. And eventually I found ways to go inside of these buildings and draw and look at what was inside of them, the equipment that was stored inside. And one place that I drew that was can serve as an example is the drawing on the left here is a machine that was used in the textile industry. I think it was a carding machine, and it was one of a group of machines that were stored in a warehouse in Lowell, Massachusetts. They were owned by the Textile History Museum in Lowell, but the museum hadn't opened yet, and all their equipment from the late 1800s was stored in this vast dark warehouse, and it was all pushed together. And I had the opportunity to go in there and draw and be alone with these very anthropomorphic machines with a lot of moving and working parts. And I really was attracted to this challenge of drawing on site and responding to these objects that were so amazing to begin with. And I didn't make any preliminary sketches. I went in, I figured out the scale and the proportions and the composition and the perspective all at once. I was interested to see if I could pull that all together. And then I was interested to see how much I could scale up the drawings. And so in some ways they have a kind of a giant sketchbook aesthetic to them. I found a lot of other places to draw as I went along. I spent a lot of time researching places and asking permission. This is also a carding machine on the left and an image from a power plant on the right. I think after a while, the objects became excuses to draw, that I was really interested in the drawing process and in seeing what I could do with these site drawings. They're really big drawings. They were drawn in 4 hours or 5 hours, and then I might do a little bit more in the studio. But it was really about, they were really direct. It was really about process.
Great. I just want to say that when we first started looking at your work together in the studio, we pulled out these large drawings, and we looked at them a lot on the floor. So that was my experience, my only experience of them really, until we got them into the Cantor Gallery. And I know that a lot of them haven't, in recent years, been shown in sort of formal gallery settings. Some of them maybe never have been shown in formal gallery settings. And for me, there was some sort of leap of faith in, bringing them to the gallery and hanging them on the wall. And I was wondering if you had any sort of feelings about that challenge of bringing these sort of quick process, works into the gallery, their size, their scale, putting them up, in a formal setting like this for the first time. And, were you worried about them taking up so much real estate in the Cantor Gallery?
Sure. I was curious to see how they would look, beside the later work, which has a really different feeling. I think they speak, they're the largest objects in the show done in the shortest amount of time. They have, this kind of drawing speaks a different language than the kind of drawings that I used in the Joy, Sorrow, and Concern exhibition. And I think one way to think about that is whether a quick drawing can take up a lot of emotional space in a gallery and stand up to a lot of looking. And so in talking about that, I want to take a look at a show that was in Cantor Gallery a few years ago of Robert Beecham's drawings. We are at Holy Cross is really lucky to own in its collection over 700 of Beecham's drawings. And he was an expressionist painter who worked in most of the late 1900s. And he really was an artist who used a lot of different materials and followed the leads of his materials. He builds his drawings sometimes out of one long continuous line, which never stops. He was a figurative artist, but his figures are very abstract and very expressive. And he used all kinds of materials. He wiped and he scraped and he poured things on and he splattered things on. And he was very physically involved with his materials. They were, in many cases, speedy, fast drawings, and yet they have a huge expressive range. He gets the fears and the emotions of the characters that he drew, who were often people that he knew, and he examines very deeply the sort of internal psyche of his characters. So this is an example of drawings that can be very fast, but can also hold a lot of expressive power.
I'm going to interrupt with a question from Beth Sweeney, which is very apropos of this conversation. So she says, Susan, how much are you concerned about the stages by which a work might gradually become legible and coherent to a viewer, or how a viewer might be prompted to resolve the relationship between the parts and the whole?
Well, I think that's a good question. And I think it's different for different kinds of work. You know, I think in making a book, for example, the stages are very slow, and I want the viewer to kind of go through some of the same process of putting the parts back together to get meaning out of the work and to build a more fragmentary piece. But in these big drawings, it's very immediate, and the effect is just simply standing in front of it and experiencing it, because it came out of my experience of being someplace and responding to the moment that I was in that place. So I guess I'm more concerned about that now in my work than I was when I was doing this work.
Great, and I think that this is the second part of her question, which can lead us into talking more about your more current work, which was, you know, what role does narrative play in your work? And I think, you know, it's a time to look at books and to talk about this shift that you made from these large scale drawings and, you know, observational drawings and prints from those drawings into this book format. So can you tell us a little bit about that transition from, you know, what we were just looking at into this more sort of slow and intimate form?
Yes. First, I didn't really have a notion of an artist's book until I had my first teaching position, and we invited, this is not an answer to that question, but it's an intro to how I learned about artist books.
Yeah,
that
I asked several questions. So.
We invited an artist named Susan Schmidt, who came to Pennsylvania, where I was teaching, from the Center for Book Arts in New York City. And she came to do a book performance for our class, and for a class, and she showed up bearing a huge box in her hands and walked out in front of the students and put this box down. And this box turned out to be a book of unfolding parts and units, which she proceeded to unfold and set up and build as a wall around herself and step into and create like an architectural enclosure for herself and fan the pages back and forth in her hands And she was really doing a performance with a book performance. And then she sort of reversed her process and made the book smaller and smaller and folded it back up to a box and walked off, all without any words. And this really opened up to me the idea that a book could be something beyond a container of words, that it could be a physical object that would be really interesting and composed of unfolding parts. And she sort of created the narrative herself with her body in the book in that case. So I started to take workshops and try to learn about both traditional bookmaking and artists' books. I really started to do these books, though, myself when I became a parent, which was about the time I started teaching at Holy Cross, first as a foster parent, and then we adopted our children. I had much smaller bits of time to work. I had to fit my work into little fragments of time. I was busy. I wanted my work to be closer to home on a lot of levels, both in term physically closer to home, and also I wanted the subject matter to be closer to what I was going through as a new parent. I did try to do big, large-scale drawings of children, but they were fun, but they just didn't work out as the right way to express my subject matter. And so I started to explore making books. Books, I think, are better at expressing, they're good ways to express a narrative, and they're also really small scale domestic objects. Everybody's familiar with books. You can make a book in your kitchen table. They're very forgiving. You can start working on a book and put it aside and then come back to it a month later. They're just great vehicles to talk about experiences that are personal. And so I started to make books that explored my experience as a parent. And I think in the next slides, you can see some of those early books that use images of children, right? These are two books from that time in the 1990s. They are books that have, some of the pages are covered with wax, and they use Xerox transfer images of children. The book on the right is held together by a keychain, and it uses images of children that are sort of fading in and out on one side and words on the other side. The text that I was using was from a training that I had received from the state in order to be a foster parent, and it detailed some of the psychological changes that children go through when they're being moved from home to home. And so I took this sort of document that I had gotten from the state and took lines out of it and used it along with pictures of children. And so this raises the whole idea of using pictures of children in your work. These were children that I knew or took care of. But at that time, I was interested in researching other artists that used images of children. It's a kind of a tricky subject matter to use because children have often been treated in a way that's sentimentalized or romanticized. If you look back at the history of images of children, and more recently in advertising, children have been treated as, sexualized objects used to sell Calvin Klein jeans. And I was not interested in that, but I wanted to understand it. And there's a wonderful book by Anne Higonnet called Pictures of Innocence, where she talks about that history. And she also reviews some of the photographers in the 1980s who were exploring children in a different way. The best known is probably Sally Mann or Wendy Ewald. They were taking pictures of children, sometimes children that they, either in their family or children that they worked with, but their pictures show what she calls knowing children, children who understand, they have internal lives of their own, they know about themselves, they understand their own experience, and they're not just, objects of adult sentiment. So it was helpful to read about other artists, and I wondered what I could do, since I was interested in drawing and printmaking, to explore childhood and childhood imagery. So this kind of, the book set up a little bit of contrast. The text says you are angry at your child, but
Yeah.
the picture shows a child that you're not angry at, obviously, and that you have very strong feelings about. And in thinking about books and book objects, I think the next slide shows the show that we had here. So this was a very influential show on me by the artist Annick Vinay, and I think Paula is going to explain a little bit about Annick and her work.
Yeah, and Annick Vinay was a French artist whose work was shown at the Cantor Gallery in the spring of 2009. It was part of her work was part of an exhibition highlighting artists' books. Later that summer, in conjunction with the Word and Image conference organized by Professor Maurice Garasht in the English department, the work that was shown was created between 1979 and 2008. Vinay's studio is in Gigondas, France. She collaborates with contemporary writers and poets, translating their words into physical objects. Their text serves as her inspiration, and the books that she creates have been described as theater for the written word. You can tell from the images here that Vinay incorporates a variety of techniques and methods such as engraving and typography, and transforms an array of materials including handmade paper, ceramics, wood, glass, plastic, metal, into inventive and singular objects.
And she came to Holy Cross and designed a book that a seminar that I was teaching with Professor Beth Sweeney in the English department. Our students executed her book as a group project, as a class, and the whole experience was really great. So her books have been influential on my understanding of the book. And then the next piece is a book that I made after getting a questionnaire from an adoption agency. And the questionnaire, this is when we were adopting children, and the questionnaire asked, what kind of child would you accept? And it gave you sort of multiple choice answers. Would you accept a child with medical problems? Would you accept a child with developmental difficulties? Would you accept an interracial infant? And I thought about, in many ways, it was startling to see these kind of fundamental, basic questions laid out so bluntly on a piece of paper. And I thought about how seldom in our public lives we get to talk about things like this, how these children are accepted and how we ourselves feel about accepting them. And I decided to remake this questionnaire in another form. This is sort of documents the questionnaire and my experience of getting it. I took the questions directly from the questionnaire and I printed them out, or I probably Xeroxed them at that point, and put them on these paint chips that I had from paint samples from a paint store. And they swing around on rings like the pages in a book, so you can see the different answers to the questions. And on the back of them, there are images of children that are layered with wax, and the children are sort of doing their own resourceful and going about their own lives and, oblivious to these adult questions that are being asked about them. They're simply living their lives as children. So that's the story of Would You Accept? And I made some other books about parenting and a number of other books, but I'll end by just talking about this last book, which is my recent book, and it goes back to the question that Beth Sweeney asked about narrative, and in fact was influenced a lot by teaching with Beth. This book is called Once There Was and Once There Was Not. I had been to visit the American Antiquarian Society and look at their early children's books in the early 1900s. People were very inventive with paper and could make books with movable wheels that spun around and changed the picture, or a tab that you pulled out that transformed one picture into another picture. And I wanted to try to make a book with movable parts. And so I started here with the story of Fitcher's Bird, which my students will be familiar with. And I concentrated on the very beginning of the story about the violence that befalls three sisters. And then the three sisters are clever enough to put themselves back together again and escape. So the colored pages that you see in yellow and red include the lines from that section of the story, the fairy tale. And they also were printed with pronto plates that are kind of abstractly express the themes in the story. The black and white pages, which were alternating pages, are etchings of girls, and they show another story. And the other story was a story that sort of paralleled what happened to the three sisters in Fitcher's Bird. It was a story that happened to one of my children as a teenager when she was followed down the street by a man in a black pickup truck who was threatening to her, and how she eventually found her way out of that problem. She, in order to read the story, you have to peer through these little slots in the paper and read this little tiny text and follow it around in a circle. So it's a more private story. And then if you pull each little tab down, you get a third story. And the third story is a story of a parent remembering her own teenage years and some of her own risky decisions. And so I was hoping that the reader would be able to go back and forth between these three stories, which include some of the same lines and words. So it proved to be really complicated for people to read. I don't know how many practice books I made in making this. And in the end, my daughter Claudia made a voice recording of the different characters in the stories, whispering the parts back and forth. And so I think even if you can't follow the entirety of the three stories, you can still kind of get fragments of what's going on and get the feeling of what's going on. And this was another project that took a long time to come together and a lot of remakes. And what I learned from this is that it is really hard to make books with movable parts. It takes a lot of trials. Yeah, something I'll come back to, I hope.
Susan, I just wanted to make a comment about the audio portion of this piece when we had it installed in the gallery and going for several days. Your daughter, an adolescent voice narrating the story was a really sort of poignant dimension to this piece. Unfortunately, we weren't able to share it here in this format, but we're hoping to be able to get it transferred onto the website. So we'll give that a go.
It would have been a strange, distracting sound that we're all hearing. Beth Sweeney had another question, which is relevant to this book, which is about the connection between these intricate paper constructions and the basket prints that we haven't talked about here. But here we're looking at a basket on one of the pages and talking about Fitcher's Bird. So it's and also thinking about the kind of intricacies of this book, where you're pulling the different parts and exposing different parts of the narrative and then hiding them, if that's related to your interest in the basket form.
Thank you. Yes, it really did kick me off on the basket prints. The basket is a repeated motif in Fitcher's Bird, and watching my students through the years interpret that among other fairy tales, they often use the image of a basket. And so in this book, some of the more abstract shapes were inspired, like the prints were inspired by thinking about a basket or a basket unraveling. And then I tried to imagine, in my head, I always wondered, like, if you could trap a girl in a basket and take her off into the woods, like, what would that basket look like? It would have to be a very unique basket. And I tried to imagine that, and I started doing some drawings of baskets, and that led me into this series of prints about baskets. And eventually it was more about printmaking and layering and enjoying the drawing process. But it was Yeah, it was about, it did get started with this image of the basket in Fisher's bird. Yeah.
I also wanted to make a comment, especially for those students who are listening in, and hearing you talk about how this work has coalesced with your teaching, and how, you know, teaching bookmaking has brought out new ideas for you. I think it's very poignant to think about the kinds of restrictions that you were talking about, you know, moving from large scale drawings into the book form, and being a forgiving form, or something that you can work on, you know, in a small scale at your kitchen table. And it's something that we're all thinking about right now is, you know, what is the domestic version of the work that we've been doing, and what's the kind of work that we can do when we really only have this much headspace to devote to it. I thought that was an important thing to sort of dwell on, is that, you know, I always love stories from artists about what happens when their life shifts, or their living circumstances change, and what their work does as a response to it. And I think this is a really great example for people to see and hold on to. I also wondered myself, when you were talking about this, about your own, how teaching over these years has informed your work in general. So, you know, how teaching in a liberal arts college, but also how that sort of constant assessment and interaction has challenged or informed your work.
Well, I think I really enjoy working with students who bring so many different ideas from so many different disciplines into their work. Particularly in book projects, we have people that are English majors or biology majors. There's a student now exploring romantic poetry in one of her full books, who is taking texts that I wasn't familiar with and making them very concrete physical forms that make them accessible to the rest of us. And I think it really is a privilege to teach students at a time in their lives when it's a very intense time, when people are sorting out a lot of questions about identity and finding their own personal voices, and pulling together ideas from a lot of different disciplines. And it really is a privilege to see all of those things come together. And of course, I'm always impressed by the energy of students and how much can be accomplished in such a short period of time, when somebody has to make a, you know, really elaborate, complicated book form, and it's due in 3 weeks, and they manage to pull it off. So that can be inspiring too.
A while ago, David Hammond asked a question that I wanted to save, because it's a good, it's one that sort of speaks to the whole exhibition, and to a lot of things. So he asked about the title of the piece, Joy, Sorrows, and Concerns, which is also the title that we used for the exhibition. Can you tell us a little bit about that title? He's familiar with it as a phrase used in Unitarian worship, as a public prayer. So can you talk to us about what those words mean to you?
It really comes from my experience as a Quaker. We have the meeting that I attend, we have the last part of the meeting. Somebody invites people to share their joys, sorrows, and concerns. And after an hour of sitting in silence together, there's a real feeling of community that enables people to share things with each other. And I wasn't aware that it was also used in other religions, and then also it refers to my thinking as an artist, that I hope that as I get older, my work really does tap more into the idea of community, and sort of my interest in engaging with community issues and community concerns. And so I hope there's a little bit of overlap between my work as an artist and my thinking as a Quaker. Yeah.
It's beautiful. I mean, it was a great title when we were putting the show together and thinking about the piece, but also just keeps bearing more and more fruit for me personally, as we think about, you know, artistic practice and the space in the world that we're living in, and how we're connecting with one another. So sort of, I keep returning to it as sort of a trinity of words to keep mulling over what are my joys and my sorrows and my concerns. This is a time, we're almost at the end of our time here, but this would be a great moment to ask, for those of you who had questions that were lingering. I want to just show you, in the last day that we had, with the exhibition before the college sort of shut down and we all went dark, Paula had gone through and done a video walkthrough of the exhibition. So I thought that we could play this as we're sort of talking through the last couple questions here. And this is something that we've posted on our various social media platforms, and that will be on this web page that we create for Susan's show. Millie Figueroa asks if you mean that there's a joy, that the joy part calls for a sense of hope in each artwork, if you think concretely about joy and sorrows and concerns with your work.
That's a good question. I thought about that when I titled the show, because I think the sorrow and concern may be more obvious than the joy, but in choosing to make work that is about, say, issues of children moved from family to family, there is a hope that in making the work that other people can connect to it and other people can respond with their own ideas. So I guess the joy is the joy of hoping that my work will connect with other people.
There was a question earlier from Mark Freeman who asked about the large-scale drawings. He says, what was it about those old machines and the vacancy of those places that attracted you?
Oh, that's a good question. It was very dramatic to work there. I found a number of places to work. In that case, I was pretty much alone working in this warehouse with this old equipment, and it was an enchanting place. The equipment seemed to take on its own, they became characters of their own. I also had the chance to go into the old Charleston Navy Yard buildings and draw a lot of the big metal stamping machinery and forges that were there, and that was a similar situation. Other places were more out in public, in like lawn statuary places and places where people could pop in and out and see what was going on. But the abandoned places certainly have a certain kind of lure and thrill to working there.
Great. So it's so nice to have this walkthrough so that everyone can see how the show was laid out. And it's, we all loved having it for the 2 days and then we had it, and that loved working with Susan on this show. It's been such a pleasure. For those of you who, if you have extra questions or if you have any comments or thoughts about this webinar or the format, or want to contact us, feel free to contact any of us, myself, Paula, Susan. We're happy to answer any questions. And we're so glad that you were able to join us today. I think this was something that we're obviously had to do a lot of quick thinking to make it happen, but we're really glad that we did. Just as one last question, somebody's asking if there's a catalog for the show.
Not yet. Yeah.
Not yet. It's something we're hoping to, we weren't planning on, but we're reconsidering right now, because we would love to give this show some legs to carry it into the future. So we're exploring possibilities for that, and check back with our website and however you contact us, social media, and we'll keep you apprised on the possibility of a future catalog.
We also have a final comment from Christy, who says that this was a spot of joy and such a difficult time. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming.
Great.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.